Tonight with anti-nuclear activist Harvey Wasserman and the Idaho chairman of the American Nuclear Society, Richard Lindsay, we'll hear two very different views of the safety and future viability of nuclear power. Good evening. One of the raging debates in this country right now involving politicians, government regulators, utility officials, scientists, and activists of all stripes concerns the future of nuclear power. How safe is it? How cost-effective is it? How do we handle the waste products? And how do we find out the truth about nuclear power? Such questions are being widely debated not just in this country but around the world, really, but they seem particularly relevant in Idaho. This state does have one of the nation's premier nuclear research and testing facilities, the Idaho National Engineering Laboratory in eastern Idaho. So tonight we're going to be putting some of these questions in the continuing nuclear debate to two guests. In Pocatello tonight, Richard Lindsay, the chairman of the Idaho section of the American Nuclear Society. Mr. Lindsay has worked in the nuclear field for 24 years and currently works at the INEL facility. And in Boise, Harvey Wasserman, author of the book Killing Our Own: The Disaster of America's Experience with Atomic Radiation. Mr. Wasserman, let me begin with you. The premise of your book, if I state it correctly, is that nuclear power is dangerous, we shouldn't have it, and there's a possibility at least that it is already, radiation has killed literally thousands of people in this country.
Well, I think that last statement is a definite. Human-made radiation has definitely killed many thousands of Americans, both in the form of nuclear fallout from our weapons testing program and in the course of natural or normal emissions from nuclear power reactors. In addition to that, virtually everyone in this country has been exposed to medical x-rays, which may have contributed to some of the health problems, although I think there is a future for medical x-rays.
How do you know, excuse me, how do you know that?
Well, the epidemiological evidence is overwhelming. There have been studies done by scientists and epidemiologists throughout the course of the years. There have been preliminary studies done on the upwards of 250,000 GIs who were exposed to the nuclear test program in the South Pacific and at the Nevada test site. There have been populations living around nuclear power reactors for many years in this country with preliminary indications, again, that there have been serious medical effects. And even there have been some preliminary studies of people who've been exposed to too many medical x-rays. All of that adds up to a very serious problem. And the basic conclusion of Killing Our Own, which is a full spectrum investigation, not of the potential dangers, but of the actual impacts of human-made radiation on the American population, is that the killing power of atomic radiation has been grossly underestimated by the government and by the industry in general, and that in fact many more people have died or been injured because of human-made radiation than we've been led to believe, and that the problem is far more serious than the industry would like to let on.
Discounting for a moment, not in terms of its impact or severity, but the victims of these atomic tests in the 50s particularly, most people would agree today that that was not the right thing to do, to expose people to those kinds of tests. But you're saying that living next to a nuclear power plant is potentially, or not even potentially, it is a dangerous thing.
There's no doubt that it's a dangerous thing. There are studies at as many as a dozen nuclear reactors, commercial nuclear reactors around the country, that indicate that in fact the infant death rate among human beings has been affected. Killing Our Own did show that there was a very definite impact on radiological releases at the 3 Mile Island accident that helped raise infant death rates in the city of Harrisburg and did harm farm animals in the area around 3 Mile Island. This study in front of me on radiological effects on animal and human populations near INEL gives me preliminary indication that the same may be going on among the relatively sparse but still very real and very human population near the INEL facility.
And you argue that in effect there's been a cover-up of this on the part of the industry, government officials?
Oh, absolutely. In the 1950s, of course, the Atomic Energy Commission was telling people in Nevada and Utah that there was no possible danger from radioactive fallout from those tests, and we now know that tragically that's absolutely not been the case. And we're hearing the same basic song from the nuclear industry now about atomic reactor facilities and about weapons facilities. And once again, it's not the case. For example, studies at the Rocky Flats plutonium facility near Denver have shown a very marked increase in cancer among the civilians living near the plant as opposed to far away. That just seems to be epidemic around the country.
And the bottom line is we ought to quit nuclear power as an energy source
and stop making nuclear weapons. And we do have an 80% consensus in this country for a nuclear freeze. That means really the public does not want us to continue building nuclear weapons as a whole. And I think since 3 Mile Island, public opinion has swung very sharply against atomic reactors. The industry is pretty much in very serious condition, both for economic and political reasons. And it's time we explored other sources of energy, safer and less environmentally destructive.
I think, Mr. Lindsay, that you're going to disagree with almost everything Mr. Wasserman said. So why don't you just make a general comment first, and then we'll get to some of the specifics he raises.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Yes, I certainly do disagree. And as a matter of fact, though we have a man with us here that has written a book and makes a living as he goes around the country speaking to this subject, nevertheless, his book is seriously flawed with the facts that are purported to be in the book. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of internal inconsistencies. I don't have a copy of the book in front of me, but some of the studies, for example, that he cites of the effects around nuclear plants are done by a man that he's well acquainted with, Ernest Sternglass, who is so discredited within the energy field, and those people who publish technical refereed publications that he can't get a hearing. And as a matter of fact, he uses an interesting technique. Sternglass was in Utah just recently trying to scare the people there as if they weren't scared enough due to the problems that they had in southern Utah. And what he tends to do is to pick a particular spot on a curve which would show a direction that would be, of course, harmful and something that would not appear to be safe, and then use that. And as a matter of fact, most people, I think, understand that statistics of births and deaths and cancer, other diseases, tend to fluctuate. That is, not everyone dies at one time. And
so as a basic premise, you're just suggesting that Mr. Wasserman, the way he conducts his research and the way the data was collected for his book, for example, is flawed.
That's correct. And as a matter of fact, the cases that he includes in his book have been discredited numerous times by not only august committees in this country, but in Canada, in Europe, and the preponderance of scientists have, in case after case after case, discredited those things. And as I mentioned, there are internal inconsistencies which I could mention, and we probably will talk about.
Well, let me ask you about a couple of the specifics he just raises here. I know folks who view this issue from your perspectives are frequently say that no one has died as the result of a nuclear accident related to a nuclear power plant, for example. But you heard Mr. Wasserman say that the evidence is overwhelming that people who live near nuclear power plants, for example, are in some danger.
Well, I disagree with that, of course. And it's tough for a scientist to talk about relative danger because there is no such thing as complete black nor white. And so as Mr. Wasserman knows, when he has someone who has a technical background on a program with him, he can speak in what he would term absolutes, or what I would term absolutes at least. And it's a little difficult for a technical person to do that because when you speak of danger, there's always danger in in any activity. Certainly there's danger being in front of these lights that one will explode and blind you or something like that. The danger is very small. However, as we take a good hard look...
But he's talking, excuse me for interrupting, but
Yes.
he's talking about a magnitude of danger that I think, if I understand him correctly, would be easily recognizable if only people would look for it. You're just saying that's just not right.
That's correct. And let me give you an example. The Tom Mancuso report that he spends a lot of time with in his book, and others have, as to the effects on the workers at Hanford. That report has some very questionable background as to what went on to gathering the data and that sort of thing. But would we really see the difference if what he says is true? The question is, with the number of cancers that were found, it turns out that the chicken farmers in Washington have a mortality rate about 5 times that of the nuclear workers in Washington. So if you really think that you can see the difference in that, and the dairy farmers. Now, I happen to be half owner of a dairy here in Idaho, and I'm a native Idahoan, and understand some things about that sort of thing, and maybe I can understand why a chicken farmer or a dairy farmer might be exposed to chemicals and things that would create perhaps a little more hazard in one area, a health hazard. But using their own numbers, the numbers are very small.
And you would reject Mr. Wasserman's final contention that we ought to quit nuclear power as an energy source?
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, I would also state that nuclear power will be the energy source of the future after it goes through the teething that even electricity had to go through when its detractors were crying, woe is me.
Okay, let me go back to Mr. Wasserman here. It seems to me that both of you gentlemen, and this is not the first time that this has happened, obviously, you can't even agree on where to begin the discussion about what is what in this. Am I correct? I mean,
Well, I think we do agree on the fact that there is clearly some danger to living near a nuclear power plant. As he says, there is no black and white. And what I'm saying is there is obviously a danger living near a nuclear power plant. I think he would say that there is certainly not a zero danger of living near one. And what I'm saying is that the industry has grossly underestimated the actual dangers involved.
Mr. Lindsay, as a practical matter, wouldn't you who work in the industry, wouldn't it be in your self-interest, so to speak, to underestimate or to not to exaggerate the danger, if you will?
No, as a matter of fact, it would be, if we were to underestimate the danger, we would be fools. And for some reason, I just can't believe that the thousands of people in the nuclear industry are fools, nor are they trying to hide something. As a matter of fact, I have been in the nuclear business working on breeder reactors for 24 years, starting with EBR-1, which was the world's first nuclear power plant, and I've operated that plant. I have 7 children and a family that I'm proud of, and I feel that I would like to live as long as I possibly could, and I'm sure that Mr. Wasserman feels that way. And I would be crazy if I were to espouse something that I absolutely don't believe in, that would go against my own best interests.
And possibly
Okay.
harm your own health, Mr. Wasserman?
Well, as a matter of fact, there are people who talk a lot about the craziness of the nuclear industry. You've said that Dr. Ernest Sternglass has been discredited. I will certainly dispute that. And the fact of the matter is that the prime critics of the atomic industry have come from the atomic industry. Dr. Sternglass was a major factor in designing some of the early reactors that, and he did in fact work for Westinghouse, as well as being a leader in the field of studying radiology at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. John Goffman, who really gave birth to much of the criticism of the nuclear power reactor industry, was on the Manhattan Project and was a leader in the field of atomic reactor technology. Dr. Thomas Mancuso, who was mentioned, was commissioned by the Atomic Energy Commission to do the study that he did on the Hanford workers. And I'm sure you're as well aware as I am of the games that can be played with numbers. And when you cite chicken farmers, I will tell you again that, as you well know, that the Mancuso study showed that the death rate among the workers at Hanford was higher than the normal general population. If you want to talk about picking out particular populations, that's your own game. Dr. Brose, Dr. Tamplin, wait, well, let me just finish.
All right.
Dr. Rosalie Bertell, Dr. Carl Z. Morgan, all these critics of the nuclear industry have come straight from the nuclear industry and have come out saying, yes, in fact, the nuclear industry is crazy. And if you look at what's happened to the atomic reactor industry now, you will find that the chief critics and the most devastating critics of the nuclear reactor industry are workers and engineers and contractors coming off the nuclear sites who are saying that the business of building these nuclear power plants is terribly corrupt, very dangerous, and the reactors that are being stopped, such as Zimmer, Marble Hill in Indiana, Midland in Michigan, Diablo Canyon, which was held up for 8 years, the chief critics of those reactors are people who have been building those reactors, and they've seen the light.
Mr. Wasserman, have a point there, Mr. Lindsay, that the critics do come from the industry in some measure?
In some cases,
Most cases.
that's true. In some cases, it's not true. Ralph Nader certainly didn't come from the industry. Neither did Jane Fonda, and there's an equally long list of people who have done rather well in the profession of criticizing the nuclear industry. However, recently a number of surveys, as a matter of fact, some rather formal and some informal, have been made questioning those experts who are trained in the energy field. And it turns out that only 1% of those, of the experts, that is the technically capable people of making informed judgments in the energy field, are in any way anti-nuclear. And I'd say that contrary to, I think, probably what even the public would believe, shows that the preponderance of people are, with the proper background, are
well, they also seem to be making a living from the energy. You know, if you're going to play the game of tracking down people's income, one would hardly expect people who are on the dole, as it were, from the nuclear industry to criticize it. You know, Ralph Nader, but incidentally, was a lawyer for General Motors before he went into the business of opposing General Motors and of watching out for the environment in general.
Well, you have to understand that lawyers are not technically trained necessarily, and furthermore...
Well, of course, if you're talking about epidemiology, then so-called engineers and energy experts aren't trained either. I mean, if you really want to get down to it, what you're saying is that engineers who run trains should be capable of helping the people that they run over with their trains. That's not the kind of training we're talking about. Just because you can operate a nuclear power plant doesn't mean that you can monitor the health effects of that nuclear power plant. That's an entirely different field.
Let's have Mr. Lindsay respond.
I think your analogy isn't all that swell. As a matter of fact, in the nuclear business, as you well know, are thousands of well-trained professional medical people trained in all of the aspects that have to do with the health effects of ionizing radiation.
And many of them have come out and said that that's where the problem is. That's where Goffman, of course, is a medical doctor.
When you speak of many, you're speaking of a very tiny minority.
Well, maybe a majority.
Not the majority, even close.
I'm not sure we're not going to make a whole lot of progress on this point. Let me raise another one. Mr. Wasserman has said that there is some body of evidence, Mr. Lindsay, to conclude that folks living near the INEL facility should have some reason to be concerned about where they live. You would dispute that with great vigor, I'm sure.
We were, the first I heard of that report, of course, was when, I guess a few months ago it first came out, and some of our people have looked at it. I was more interested, I think, in the Department of Health's evaluation, in that they discredited the report. We have seen some results of a person from Boise coming over to the people around the INEL and suggesting some problems that to rather bias a report. The report is flawed and, as a matter of fact, has been discredited by the Department of Health, which I think makes it a little more credible. And I'd like to just make another...
Let me just, I'm one, like most of our audience, I would suggest, who do not understand these numbers very well. So let's try to talk in terms of specific examples. You're concerned about the methodology of that report, Mr. Lindsay, am I correct? The way the data was compiled.
Yes, that's part of it.
Okay. Mr. Wasserman?
Well, I'm concerned about well-known radiation releases from INEL. Now, you would not dispute that three members of the military were killed at the SL-1 reactor on January 3rd of 1961. And by some estimates, as many as 80 curies of iodine-131 were released in that accident. 80 curies of iodine-131 is 5 times more than the amount of iodine-131 that was admitted to have been released at 3 Mile Island in 1979. Now, that kind of emission is not inconsequential, and I do think it's something that, if I were living near INEL, I would certainly be concerned.
Mr. Lindsay?
All right, let's put that in perspective. 80 curies of iodine. We recently had a volcanic eruption from Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens has, as you probably know, a certain percent of the material in Mount St. Helens was uranium. And if you calculate the volume of material that was ejected in the atmosphere, you find that about 15,000 tons of uranium were ejected in the atmosphere on May 18th alone. That represents 5,000 curies of alpha emissions from that uranium. 5,000 curies. Right. Mr. Wasserman will tell you that he's far more concerned about the alpha emission from plutonium or uranium than anything else. At least he will in his book. He may not here today.
I'll tell you that. That's fine.
The total alpha emitters that came from Mount St. Helens were about 22,000 curies.
Well, what's the point?
The point is simply this. The 80 curies of iodine were released, did not represent a health hazard to anyone nearby. If the anti-nuclear people are correct, we will see 100 million extra lung cancers from the eruption of Mount St. Helens, and it's completely ridiculous.
In fact, it may very well happen. And, you know, you cannot say that because we get radioactivity from the background or from natural eruptions like Mount St. Helens that we should therefore turn around and dose ourselves with radiation. It's like saying 40 million people died during World War II, therefore we don't need to worry about people shooting each other on the streets of Boise. It's a very different situation here. We have a government entity and private entities consciously emitting radiation into the atmosphere, measurable quantities of radiation, which we know do damage to the human organism. There is absolutely no reason for us to not take responsibility for those emissions simply because there are also other sources of radiation. Well, that is hucksterism at its worst level.
You are taking responsibility, Mr. Lindsay, for such things?
Yes, as a matter of fact, we certainly are. Now, let's go back to an example that perhaps
if you could make this relatively quick, because I want to raise the question about the future of nuclear power if we have enough time to do that. So please go ahead, though.
Just want to say this, that the government is very careful in what they do. Early on, of course, some mistakes were made. We've learned a lot about radiation in the last number of years. I would like to just raise the question, however, that if Mr. Wasserman and his people are so concerned about the health effects and what government does, why aren't they out crusading that the government used to hand out cigarettes to the soldiers in World War II, and far many more died and contracted cancer than even their numbers will show from radiation. So I think that Mr. Wasserman and the people that have his position have quite a different agenda than nuclear power per se.
Well, in fact, I don't smoke, and I encourage all my friends to not smoke. I think smoking is a terrible habit. And I'm very appalled that the government did, in fact, hand out those cigarettes during World War II.
Well, I think the point,
And,
though, is that there are fewer people are affected by radiation than are affected by something like
we may not
smoking.
know. That may not, in fact, be the case. The United States government has exploded more than 200 nuclear bombs in the atmosphere. Thank goodness we don't have nuclear testing in the atmosphere anymore, and that's because citizens like myself did rise up and stop it. And I don't mean to take any credit for that. I was too young to know it was much of an issue at the time. But people were at that time were called communists, and motives were imputed to them, as Mr. Lindsay has imputed motives to me. But I think very few would dispute now that because of the atmospheric test ban, many, many thousands, if not millions, of people are alive today.
Okay.
Now we're saying those lessons have to be learned again, and that nuclear reactors have to be stopped and nuclear weapons production curtailed.
Very little time left, gentlemen. Will nuclear power, Mr. Wasserman, is it on its last legs? For what reason? Safety, cost?
In this form, it's on its last legs because it's an unworkable technology. It cannot be made both economic and cost-effective. Solar power technologies which are coming online, such as photovoltaic cells, windmills, hydropower coming down from Ontario, and so on, these are eating up the demand that was originally used to justify this current phase of atomic reactor production. Now we're seeing a situation where Westinghouse and the other major reactor builders are retrenching, and they're redesigning the industry, more or less conceding that what they've done now is bad. And
But the industry is dying. As a
in its
power
current
producer.
incarnation, it is, and but it could come back. And I think I agree with Mr. Lindsay on this. In the 1990s, in a new form, if the people who are concerned about the health and safety of the planet and of each other are not able to get the energy demand taken care of in other ways, and hopefully with clean, efficient solar, wind, tidal, and geothermal.
Is nuclear power as an energy source on its last legs, Mr. Lindsay?
No, it surely isn't. And we do have some agreement on the point that nuclear power likely or can come back. And as a matter of fact, I've spent a lot of years working on advanced designs. The water reactors that we have today, we think are the Chevrolet of the industry, and we're working on some Cadillacs.
Hope they'd get better gas mileage than Cadillacs.
Oh, they do great. And as a matter of fact, we have some designs now which are diversion proof.
That was a good slip.
Yes. Proliferation has something to do with politics, not nuclear scientists.
Well, I disagree on that.
But your point is that the technology is moving ahead, and
Absolutely.
it can be a viable energy source well into the next century.
Absolutely. And what the work that's going on at the INEL offers the experimental evidence to back up our claims. And we will see in the next few years reactor designs that are inherently safe, that will shut themselves down without outside intervention, without emergency power. And as a matter of fact, we've been testing one for 20 years.
You're making them safer. Mr. Wasserman, are they making them safer?
They may be making them safer. They're not going to be making them any more economical or any more safe for the environment, or I think for the general population as a whole. What we have to do is fill the energy demand gap with energy sources, technologies that are in harmony with the planet rather than at war with it.
I'm out of time. I'm sorry. Mr. Wasserman, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
We appreciate it. Mr. Lindsay in Pocatello, very good of you to come in and be with us too, sir. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's our time for tonight. I'm Mark Johnson. Thank you for joining us. Good night.